Dr. Richard, how is CAR T cell therapy impacting the landscape of myeloma care?
So, as I'd hinted or alluded to previously, prior to CAR T cells appearing on the horizon, we had very limited options for patients who the first several lines of therapy. So once they had been exposed to two proteasome inhibitors, two IMiDs, and an anti-CD38 antibody, which is the three major class of myeloma drugs. They are then called triple class exposed or penta exposed, depending on how many of these drugs they've been exposed to. We had a study called the Mammoth study this was published back in 2019, prior to the era of CAR T cells and other T cell directed therapies. And at the time, they had looked at patients who were triple class exposed and who had been exposed to daratumumab and were refractory to daratumumab as their last line of therapy. And what we saw was with their next line of therapy or whatever else was available at the time for patients such as these, their expected response rate was only about 30% or so, number one. Two, their outlook was very poor with a median progression-free survival, which means that, the amount of time that patients could go without the disease coming back of being, and that median progression-free survival was less than 6 months. And their expected even median overall survival was well under a year. So that was what the landscape looked like when CAR T cells came onto the scene. Then, with the, for instance, the CARTITUDE trials, which is, one of the approved products, which is cilta-cel, which is what we have now, we actually saw for this same group of patients, the response rates was now 98%. Deep responses were 83%. And we now have the final readout of their median progression-free survival, which is almost 3 years. So you can see a significant difference, under 6 months median progression-free survival to 3 years. And patients were living, over 50% of the patients were living over 3 years. So that's kind of where we are at. I mean, so it was no small improvement. This considerably kind of almost reset the bar and has given a new lease of hope and life to patients who had advanced myeloma. And, one of the things we say in myeloma is, although we don't as yet say that myeloma is curable, we are working, towards that, but we are also giving options for other treatments, other research to be effective in patients just by keeping them around longer.
Have there been any recent research developments involving CAR T cell therapy that patients should know about?
Absolutely. So, so much as I have highlighted all the the hope and the optimism and the good things about this, the fact is we're still not curing people with these therapies. So we call this a plateau in the survival curve, which means that if we achieve that plateau, that means the disease is probably not coming back. And we have essentially the definition of cure. But we're not seeing that. We're still seeing a downslope in the survival curves for myeloma, which means that patients are still relapsing in spite of these excellent therapies. So there's a lot of research going on into why are patients still relapsing? Is it because, they're losing the antigen which the CAR T cells are recognizing? Is it because the CAR T cells are no longer effective, even though the antigen is still present? Is it because, there's a considerable lag time between the patients being freezed or collected, the cells being collected for the genetic modification in the lab, to the time when the patients can actually receive these cells. And that can be anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks. So during this time period, patients with advanced myeloma may not remain static with their disease. The disease is progressing, they're getting worse, they may not be candidates for these kinds of therapies. So one of the areas of research is how can we speed up this process, this manufacture process? How can we make it much more available? Because they're limited by the manufacturing facilities, their abilities to have these viral vectors, to be able to transduce these cells and genetically modify. So can we take them off of those kinds of things? Can we automate this? Can we, improve these manufacturing platforms? So a lot of different things are being tested. And then, as I'd also mentioned earlier, right now they're approved for advanced myeloma, but what if we can bring them up earlier? Are patients actually going to get cured by that? Are they going to have a much better progression-free survival with that versus waiting until they're very advanced? So these are all many, many things that are being looked at. In addition, a lot of these CAR T products, these approved products, all of them are all recognizing one antigen on the myeloma cell. Now their products are being looked at that are dual target antigen recognition ability. So that's another thing. So maybe if the CAR T cells are missing one of the antigens and they're not able to use that to kill the myeloma cell, maybe the other antigen can pick up the slack. So these are various things that are being looked at.